3 a.m., that's when my alarm clock goes off. Not because I don't need sleep, but because by 3:30 there is a car waiting outside to take me to the TV studios where they will hand me 5 news stories which I've not seen before. And I'll be on air about 20 minutes after that, not before somebody's put makeup on me, lots of foundation, which I'm not used to on a daily basis, I should say. All the while I'm trying to work out what I'm going to say about these 5 stories. They could be about politics, economics, they could be about law, could be anything. Could be a story from Japan. Anywhere in the world it could be taken from. So, and with a global audience, by the way, potentially of 300 million people. So after about 10 years of doing this, not on a daily basis, thankfully, I had lunch with one of the investors in my hedge fund. And you can imagine if you're an investor in a hedge fund, you're doing rather well, and he was doing rather well, and we had lunch after one of the mornings where we'd had my BBC broadcast. And he said to me, how do you do it? How do you manage to talk relatively coherently after each one of these sessions on TV where they haven't told you what the news is? And as I began to tell him and gave him some guff about my experience as a barrister and being able to assimilate lots of information, make a coherent argument, I realised he was actually looking over my shoulder at the waitress and wasn't really paying attention to my answers. So I said to him, I have an IQ greater than that of Albert Einstein. And that caught his attention, and equally facetiously he replied, well, if you're so clever, why aren't you rich? Hence the title for today's talk. And his definition of rich is going to be different to mine. And since we have a young audience, I'm sure you're interested as well in the answer to that. And of course, it's a relative matter. But as I started researching this talk, one thing that became abundantly clear was that's not an easy question to answer. There's ample research done on this, as you'd expect. Nobel Prize winners, and I'm going to share with you the findings from some of those. But it also took me on a journey of research into, well, a whole bunch of surprising revelations to do with happiness, and wealth didn't bring that, just as our gut instinct is that it might not necessarily do so. But also an interesting journey into the lives of psychopaths and narcissists. Oh yes, there's a whole heck of a load of those who are rich as well. And I'll share you the findings so that you avoid that dangerous path as you go into your careers. 2 other things which came to mind before I dive deep into this research. One was this: you only have to look into the parking lots of the world's leading universities to see that there isn't much of a connection between intelligence and wealth. That's clear enough. Not everybody wants wealth. And that's fair enough as well. The other thing to remember, and again the research drew this aphorism out, is if you want to know what God thinks about money, just look at the people he gives it to. And I'll explain how the research shows that not only is that true and what that message is actually saying, but we better do a few things with our personalities to avoid the problem, should it be wealth that we actually want. So, without saying that it's as simple as saying we don't want it, we do. Let me just explain first of all what a fund manager does. Now, that's probably an oversimplification of what a fund manager does, and you can see elements of narcissism and psychopathy in there as well. Before you get worried that you've got the wrong person speaking here, I better move on and get on to the subject matter. If you're so clever, why aren't you rich? And let's take it as read for a moment, if you would. Just make the assumption that I have got an above average IQ. That's me at the age of 6, beating my uncle at chess. I'm the one on the right-hand side of the picture. And at 9, I had my first computer. At 12, I'd made my first investment. So where on earth are my billions? Where's my Elon Musk-like reputation for making billions and billions, or if not trillions? So what went wrong, you might say? Why was I asked by an investor in my hedge fund, if you're so clever, why aren't you rich? Don't get me wrong, it's been helpful knowing how to make money. It paid for a few bills, and it's not a bad thing. But as I delve deeper, I realized this is more than just a flippant lunchtime conversation with an investor. What suddenly became clear is this is important and it matters because research from Brewin Dolphin, the UK stockbroker, found that 94% of respondents said financial worries led to stress. Got worse. 36% said financial worries impacted their sleep. or their ability to do their job. So it had an economic impact beyond just your own mental health. Of that 36%, they also said it impacted their relationships. So it impacts family life, the life of children as well. And it led to days off work, additional sick days, just because of financial worries. That's a macroeconomic effect on the whole country. So it's not just a mental health issue. The fact that people didn't have as much money had all of these impacts. And we're not just talking people at the absolute bottom of the pyramid. We're talking all the way up. So if it is important, how do we solve the problem? And what are the unintended consequences? Because there are always unintended consequences of wealth creation. We know that. It doesn't take a Nobel Prize-winning piece of research to tell you that. Well, part of the problem which became clear in researching all of this is we might actually even be going about it the wrong way. If wealth creation is a good thing in and of itself, and becoming richer is good for your mental health and for society as a whole, if, and we'll come to that in a second, then when I researched this for my very first book, published by the Financial Times some 25 years ago, a book called Mind of a Trader, where I interviewed 10 of the world's leading traders who were extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily successful at their jobs, which is why I interviewed them, because I wanted to get into their profession. And I asked them, what made you so successful? And which is another way of asking them, how did you get so rich, and can you tell me? And doing it through a book is a good way of finding that out. The only answer which was consistent amongst all 10 of them, and they didn't know each other, the only factor they gave, and it was a frustrating answer, was they were detached from the money. They said, we just love the process. You know that old annoying phrase that, oh, if you're passionate about your work, you'll never work a day in your life? It was sort of that. Well, that isn't really a satisfactory answer, but my God, it's important. And as people choose their next career moves or move on into the world of life, do bear that in mind. It wasn't the ones who were just chasing the money in the world of hedge funds and outside of it who were the most successful. It was actually the ones who just loved the task and the job they were doing, which was far more important than what's the end goal. Oh, will this make me rich? So maybe I picked the wrong attitude. Well, we'll come to that as well. What more can the research tell me? That's my mum, by the way. Well, there's some disappointing research about Ferrari owners, if that's an illustration of wealth. What we found is, and it's one of the unintended consequences of rich, and it's some of the things you already know, certainly the parents, I'm sure, will know, is rich made for bad characters, which is satisfying to know. It also made for unhappy people, and there's nothing nicer than seeing a rich person who's unhappy. I mean, admit it, deep down, it makes you that much happier. It's just that bit of schadenfreude. But what was the research then? Well, Professor Paul Piff at Berkeley rigged a game of Monopoly. He rigged it so that only one participant would become extraordinarily wealthy in a very short space of time, and everybody else would be poor. And then they kept doing this exercise with control groups and at different audiences, and the findings were always the same. The findings were that whoever became rich in that game, their behavior changed, and they used to observe behavior through a two-way mirror. What they discovered is that the wealthier person grew meaner, their posture changed into a more dominant posture, and they began talking down to their poorer counterparts. It was just a game. It was Monopoly. It's not even as if they achieved anything in the real world, and they might have cause for arrogance. You could do this with a game. Lord of the Flies kind of thing. That's shocking. So we may well go from richness for our mental health, but the unintended consequences to personality we better be careful of. What monsters are we creating in society? Further, as I delved into the research for this talk, I came across some delicious sounding articles and pieces of research, in particular one by Institutional Investor. It was entitled Sports Cars, Psychopaths and Testosterone. Research papers which showed that initial success, in whichever career you went into, was not actually a good predictor of subsequent success. Oh, it got better. Here are some of the other articles which laid into this research. A hedge fund manager who drives a Ferrari will probably underperform. Seems counterintuitive. The very characteristics we want in society of people who are good initially are exactly the same characteristics which lead to their destruction, and worse still, those around them. The financial crisis, probably some testosterone-ridden psychopaths. Happens in politics as well. Won't delve deeper into that. Other articles covering this: psychopath hedge fund managers make less money than nice guys. There are personality traits we'll want to encourage. The more attractive psychopathic ones, the crazy narcissistic personality traits which people often flow towards, they're not good for your company, they're not good for your country. Eventually those people underperform and they end up destroying things around them. Why alpha males make bad hedge fund managers. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy lead to the worst hedge fund managers. The women in the room will be pleased to know that women make better investors than men, but that's a whole different talk. So, where does this bring us? Well, I'm going to draw these strands together in terms of what kind of society we might want when we ask the question, I want to get rich, or I'm so clever, why aren't I richer? One thing that I want to draw to your attention is the Nobel Prize winner Eugene Fama. He again found fund managers tended to underperform the market. Well, wait a minute. Fund management, my industry, it's really simple. Either you make money or you don't. There's no hiding place at all. It's not like any other profession. Either you made money or you didn't. What Eugene Fama, Nobel Prize winner, discovered is, and he took a go at virtually every investment bank on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs, for instance, under 1% of their funds, he said, delivered a market-beating return when you allowed for duration, you allowed for risk. Under 1%, but how come they're so rich? And surely they're clever at Goldman Sachs. They're rich and clever, and yet they underperform. So what were the factors which led to being rich, but actually being pretty rubbish, according to Nobel Prize winners? That is from the Financial Times in 2004. They ran a competition. When I was just a private investor, I was not a professional fund manager, I was a private investor, I was a regular individual. And over the space of a year, they ran a competition to forecast the markets. So pretty simple to see who's good, who's bad. Neil Woodford came 14th, narrowly beating the editor's cat. The cat had to just pick some numbers from the floor. It was random. He narrowly beat the cat. Over the subsequent decade and a bit, he managed to raise billions. I didn't, sadly. Neither did the cat, by the way, you should know. And then he had to apologize for his poor performance. So how is it that you can be poor performing and keep going? And the answer, it seems to lie in several things. One is name recognition. As investors, people give their money to names they recognize. They vote for names they recognize in leadership contests, for instance. Name recognition and marketing is far more important than competence. How many of us know that through the workplace? It's not who's actually good at the job, it's who's good at making out they're good at the job. That helps. Cognitive biases. There is ample evidence to show that people have, in my industry at least, a bias against certain colours of skin. There's research to prove it. Gender. Men raise more money than women do. They shouldn't. If you went on performance, those are biases. Well, we have a word for it, sexism. They're cognitive biases. That's unfair. Jawlines. Now, that's really unfair. Apparently, the stronger your jawline, the more you're perceived as a leader and trustworthy, and the more you're likely to succeed. Maybe I was just too fat to be rich. I kid you not, jawlines are important. Some of you are looking at me as if you don't believe me. It is true. It is true. And as I said, name recognition, behavioral finance research shows it time and time and time again. So again, where does this leave us? Well, in bringing all the strands together, James Heckman, another Nobel Prize winning researcher, he said IQ only had about 1% to 2% effect on whether or not you would be rich. So the answer to the question, well, if you're so clever, why aren't you rich, could be because clever is not that relevant, I'm afraid. What James Heckman, again, Nobel Prize winner, said is personality, motivation, conscientiousness, and diligence were far more important. They were far more predictive than IQ. Now, this is important because IQ can't be changed. Personality can. The parents in this room will be relieved to know. So those of you who are on the extreme side of IQ, part of the lucky sperm or the lucky ovary club, guess what? Personality can trump your natural God-given talents, which is good and it's fair to know as well. It's more likely to lead to wealth. Another thing more likely to lead to wealth, the right spouse. I'm not just saying that. The research shows it. And the personality of the spouse, whether male or female. Were they supportive? These things intuitively, parents in this room will relate to, but intuitively, we didn't realize there was ample research to prove it. So for all the unmarried people in the room, choose your spouse carefully. It has more to do with your wealth than your IQ, which is barely relevant. So strutting around being all clever, it's not going to be the thing that's going to help. I will close with this notion, which is this. How do I answer that question then? If you're so clever, why aren't you rich? Well, research from Grossman of the Royal Society said, actually, it's wisdom we need. Wisdom is needed to resolve conflict, whereas wealth doesn't help do that. So, at least I'm not unhappy. Richer people were unhappy if they weren't generous. Again, research showed that. You got richer, but you got meaner. You got unhappier, unless you were generous of your time and of your money. So at least I'm not unhappy, I'm not ungenerous, I'm not narcissistic and a psychopath, lacking in wisdom. Maybe I was just a bit unlucky with a jaw which wasn't square enough. Also, if you're extremely clever, then there was an increased probability you were likely to be poorer. They're still looking into the reasons why. It could be that you just felt you were too clever for the system. They're not sure, but that's what the research suggests. I hope within our schools, therefore, we'll talk a lot more about character beyond grades and test not for IQ alone, but for personality traits such as narcissism, as they can be changed, unlike IQ, and therefore create a wiser, happier population that is less likely to cause financial destruction, which my industry knows a heck of a lot about. Thank you.